welcome to this next Great Divorce little discussion. Again, I encourage you to actually take part in any YouTube discussion, and I'll try to do that myself. But this week, we were going to jump into the chapters of the book, but that'll actually have to wait till next week. I want to cover something that covers the entire book, as well as we covered it in one angle another time, but we need to cover it from another angle, more directly from the material of the book. And of course, I want to start off again with this idea of a thought world, or a social imaginary. And by social imaginary, I mean kind of like a collective thought world. A world where a community mutually participates in the various ideas and symbols, people, places, virtues or vices. It develops sort of a common understanding. And the reason why this is important in a community life, but more importantly just for your individual thought life, is that Lewis seeks to give you a set of characters, a set of ideas, virtues or vices that you can pull away from if they're not good or draw towards if they are good. And in everyone's life, it doesn't hurt having examples of people that you want to be like, and of course people that you don't want to be like either. And Lewis wants to place these ideas in your thought world, or in my case, in our community's thought world, so that we can have a common set of ideas and characters from which we should be drawing closer to or which we should be pushing away from. As we ourselves say, take this journey to heaven is at least our goal. So in the next weeks, we'll get to those specific characters. But in these specific characters in this book, you'll notice that the really great characters are solid people, and the not-so-great characters are see-through, ghost-like people. But the see-through, ghost-like people are kind of like us, in the sense that we're not fully mature, we're not fully developed. And there's two towns, if you will. There's Gray Town, and then there's the town up above, which we're going towards the mountain. The people from Gray Town, which is supposed to be hell, are coming up and getting this chance to rethink how they do life. And are they going to go towards the mountain, which includes God, or are they going to avoid the mountain and go back to Gray Town? It's these ghost-like individuals that we don't want to be like. And it's, of course, these other individuals, these solid people, these mature people. You see, the people from Gray Town can't handle the environment up above. They can't handle the grass, they can't handle the trees, they can't handle the food, they don't want the ideas. They seem to have learned to love Gray Town, and they don't want to grow and mature and develop and be solid enough. So Lewis's picture right away of the good individuals, the ones that have matured, are solid, full individuals. And I think this says a lot about Lewis's own picture of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to develop in God, and of course what it means to, say, go away from that picture as well. The solid people are the people we want to be like. They're worth admiring, they're worth aspiring to. Now this whole idea of development, even in the afterlife, is really, I think, built upon the idea of virtue theory or virtue ethics. Now you might be thinking, what is exactly that? And so if we're talking about virtue theory and virtue ethics, we're really sharing about character development. In order to develop the self in a way that reflects goodness, truth, and beauty, and we might liken it to, say, other ethics systems. For instance, in a lot of religious systems, there's what's called divine command theory. And in other words, and even Christianity has some of this sort of in the backdrop, especially in the Old Testament, but less and less as the people grow and mature and develop, and then you see more of virtue theory. But divine command theory is that God gives commands, and we're just supposed to follow those commands. And yeah, there's commands in the Bible, but God wants us to develop our character so that we just naturally reflect and do the right thing. Moreover, divine command theory can't account for the thousands of situations that we come upon that there's no direct command for. And so we're kind of stuck. Should we do this? Should we do that? There's no direct command for it. And so how do we know the right and the good? Well, this is where virtue theory, I think, is I think, perhaps the most powerful system of thinking about doing things, especially in the modern world, which is very complex, and there isn't a set of addressing principles for that. So there's other ethical systems as well, utilitarianism, natural law theory, and they all have something to say and all have maybe some benefit to the wide, grand picture of doing the good. But Lewis, I think, rests upon this idea of character development. And character development, he sees taking place even in the afterlife, at least in this book, that once you die, or once you're in this sort of flux of decision-making, your character development is still sort of on the rise. And the people from Greytown, the people in this book from Greytown, they've developed their choices and their character in such a way that when they see heaven, when they're up, when they take the bus ride up, and they look at heaven, and it's a strange and unusual place, they eventually don't want the place. Because the way that they've developed their character in such a way means that they have shut themselves off over thousands of little and big decisions, shut themselves off of the good and the true and the beautiful, at least in the fullest extent. And so now, because they've turned so inward, they don't want the next true, good, or beautiful thing. And so Lewis really designs this book, I think, to challenge you to character development now, to making big and small choices in such a way that they gather up and make you more prone, more open to making the good, the right, or the beautiful decision. And this, of course, is what we want to do. And he says that the goal of this really is heaven itself. And God is at the end of the good and the true and the beautiful. And so, because God is at the end of the good, the true, and the beautiful, we should be effectively making decisions, small and large, and make us more open to those things, and or strongly set on those things. And so this is sort of that beginning picture of virtue theory, I think. Now, of course, I mentioned there's Greytown, and there's a sort of middle ground, which really is sort of the beginnings of heaven, and then there is heaven, which is at the mountain. So we're going to move a little bit beyond virtue theory, and we're going to just kind of look at this picture of these two and or maybe three places. The middle ground, or heaven, those from Greytown that go up to there and don't stay, it's because they would rather have their other world. Hell, if you will, is something that they have openly begun to desire and want. And now that they've have the opportunity of heaven, because of all those character choices and the desires that they have developed earlier on, they're not able to, say, make the decisions to maturity once they move on up in the bus. We might say, those who go to hell don't want heaven. I like on page 17. They're coming up, and the bus is getting on into this middle ground and or heaven, and all of a sudden this light comes in the building, or light comes in the bus, and it says this: it was a cruel light. Now remember, this is good light, but in their experience, there was a cruel light, and I shrank from the faces and forms by which I was surrounded. This is page 17, by the way. They were all fixed faces, full not of possibilities, but impossibilities. Some gaunt, some bloated, some glaring with idiotic ferocity, some drowned beyond recovery in dreams, but all in one way or another distorted and faded. One had a feeling that they might fall to pieces at any moment if the light grew much stronger. Then there was a mirror on the end of the wall of the bus, and I caught sight of my own. Lewis is imagining this world where once the light comes on in, the better picture of these ghost-like selves is made clear. Not so beautiful faces, not so beautiful people. There's something about their character that's shining through, that the light is different than. And of course, it means that their character hasn't developed up into the place of this middle and or heaven-like ground. Solid people, these are the ghost-like people, but the solid people, they're forgiven people. You look through the entire book. They're forgiven, they're changed, they're matured, they're full, they're solid, they're able to interact with God's environment, and they have settled themselves on the need for God and on His path to maturity, which makes they end up being beautiful people, offering wise advice, challenging evil and negative things in these ghost-like people, and offering them the path of salvation. But in Greytown below, hell, if you will, is full of isolation. I mean, the people down there have isolated themselves. They can't live next to themselves. They haven't found a way of doing that, and so they want more space. And he pictures some of the worst characters, which he names as people like Caesar or Napoleon and others, have separated themselves for light years away. And you can't even find them unless you search for them for years and years, and then finally you search for them. And all the while they're going about saying, it was so-and-so's fault, it was so-and-so's fault. They're so isolated and so selfish that they've developed a world where there's nobody else in their space. But everybody down in Greytown is just like that. And isolation is really the picture that we see. And they're less than human. And as you read through the pages, you'll find the excuses that come on up. When the solid people are trying to get the ghost-like people further up the mountain so that they can become mature and be with God, you hear excuses like, well, it was everyone else's fault that I didn't get accepted. Or they deserve the blame. Or it's my rights, and I should get what I deserve, and this place isn't giving me what I deserve. Or they're unwilling to forgive, or they can't help but only think about themselves. They're not willing to give up that portion of themselves in order to have something more glorious. Now, I want to read something from page 75. If you're wanting to go there, you're more than welcome to read this on page 75. At least of my copy, it's 75. And this gets us sort of to the crux. Who goes to heaven and who goes to hell? And Lewis has this individual, this solid individual, saying this: everyone who wishes it does, meaning to go to heaven does. Never fear. There are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says in the end, thy will be done. All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find. To those who knock, it is opened. Two kinds of people. Those who say to God, thy will be done, Lord. And all that are in hell say, God says to them, thy will be done. Their will is carried out. Hell is sort of the natural byproduct of individual choices saying they want nothing to do with God and his good world. That's what we see the picture of hell being. Not necessarily place, but isolation and distance and difficulty and selfishness. That's what we see in this picture. So that's the second portion of today's discussion. But I thought it would be important to do one more little section of today's discussion, and that is on heaven, hell, and purgatory. Heaven, hell, and purgatory. So Lewis has this discussion between our main character and this other individual. I believe it's George MacDonald. And he specifically says on page 71 of my copy about the afterlife. He says, but there is a real choice after death. My Roman Catholic friends would be surprised, for to them souls in purgatory are already saved. And my Protestant friends would like it no better, for they'd say that the tree lies as it falls. Now, again, this is actually our character's voice. And then his mentor goes on, or this individual goes on, the solid person goes on to comment on that. And he says, you cannot fully understand the relations of choice and time till you are beyond both of them. Now, what do I want to say about this? Lewis extends this, I think, brilliant idea that choice and time are things different, of course, in the next world. We think of God as eternal, so he stands somehow in a different relationship to time than we do. We are morning and evening, wake and down, and we see this progression of events, but God isn't in the middle or the center of a progression of events. He is sort of complete in himself, and so there isn't a progression within himself. He's eternal, he's changeless. These sorts of categories, all-knowing, are not like us. We're not God. He sees time, and as I've said in a sermon recently, in sort of like one telescopic moment, where looking into the telescope, of the entire universe and the world. He sees all that's happening simultaneously, past, present, and future. And so this God is so unlike what we are like. So much so that I think Lewis is inserting this idea that even after death, there has to be progress. God, there is no progress within himself, but human beings, even when we die and we go to heaven, and we're not God. We're not all-knowing. We're not all perfect. We're not never changing. We're not this God, but rather, there is the possibility for change. There is the possibility for development. There is the possibility for learning and growth, because we have a brain, we have a body. These are not, say, if you will, divine things. These are human things. And so Lewis inserts this interesting idea that after death, where there is sort of something different about time, there's something different about choice, but he pictures this middle ground, if you will, this developmental phase as going to the mountain as still being the possibility of choice. Now, Lewis, of course, admits at the beginning that all this imagery is not meant to be taken literally, but I think this idea is valuable. As soon as you enter into the Protestant world today, especially in evangelical and these sorts of circles, you're going to have this picture of like that heaven is this static place, and that there is this lack of development really that takes place in you and everybody else. Once you get there, everything's like purified, perfect. You have all the knowledge that you need, and maybe this is sort of like the ghetto version of the theology of these groups. Maybe when we look at their theologians, they've offered something a little bit better. But at least sort of down in the rest of the church world, we see this idea that when Protestants get to heaven, it's all settled and done with. And of course, we want to affirm that, once to die, and then the judgment is sort of what the book of Hebrews speaks about. And yet, nonetheless, there's this idea of development that sort of rests on what it means to be a human in the first place. So there's judgment, of course, all of that settled and signed and sealed and delivered. But this possibility of developing your character and unifying with God in fuller ways seems to make better sense of the kind of individuals that we are. Now, purgatory. I am not a Lewis scholar, and so I can't tell you all of the details of Lewis's thinking on purgatory. I don't think that he's necessarily affirming it in this picture here, but I've read a few authors that have commented on his views of purgatory. So I'm neither affirming nor denying. You'll have to look into it a little bit more. But let me say this, and I think this is worthwhile considering. When the Protestant thinks of purgatory, they instantly think of the word Catholic, and then they take their hands off it, like everything a Catholic is bad. And so just because it comes from sort of a Catholic source, it must be evil, bad, and we don't want to touch it. And I've seen this a lot in the Christian world, so much so that if a Catholic theologian came out with a perfect idea, because it's Catholic, someone's going to ignore it. I want to say this to sort of the people listening, which is a small group of mostly Protestants, if I'm correct, that this is the wrong way of doing theology. You don't look at an idea's source and say, well, because it came from over there, it's really bad. If the Catholics did this with the Baptists, they would say, well, because the Baptists are the ones quoting the Bible, it must not be true. Well, just because it's Baptist doesn't make it bad. Moreover, just because it's Catholic doesn't make it bad either. How about the idea of after death, there is this place or process of purification? To the Catholic, their answer to that is yes, that's exactly what afterlife is like. And it's only for those, let's be clear, it's not out to get out of jail free card. It's only for those who are already going to the fullness of God's blessed place called heaven. Now, of course, for the Protestant, this is kind of contrary to the idea. You look at a lot of the Protestant confessions, Anglican or Methodist, and they say up front that the idea of purgatory is repugnant to the Word of God. And I think what they're trying to say is that the way this idea developed in Catholicism, especially during the time of the Reformation, that idea is repugnant, as all of the abuses that kind of came along with it. But this general idea of sort of a process of purification, I don't think Lewis is totally untouching and offering sort of this picture of virtue. Maybe we just throw away the word purgatory and we add the category of development post-death. And if development post-death is a human and yet a biblical category, then I think we're well on our way to having an idea that makes development part of the heavenly process. Now, I'll leave that for you to think about. I'm not an expert on Lewis. I certainly am not an expert on Purgatory either. But I think he's right to focus on the difficulty of understanding time and of understanding choice. And he offers this little correction, both to the Catholic and to the Protestant, who think that their picture is sort of signed perfectly and they have it all figured out. And because of the difficulty of understanding time post-death, and because of the difficulty of understanding choice post-death, Lewis says that it's difficult, but there's still some kind of developmental phase as we become one with God. Because of our limited, finite nature, there has to be something in reference to development. So this is the picture that we get in The Great Divorce, and in the weeks to come, we'll see the characters, the virtues and the vices that we don't want something to do with, or the virtues that we do want something to do with. I hope you have a good night. Be thinking about heaven, hell, and purgatory as you go to sleep tonight.